The Ideal of Human Unity. Chapter 28. Diversity in Oneness. It is essential to keep constantly in view the fundamental powers and realities of life, if we are not to be betrayed by the arbitrary rule of the logical reason, and its attachment to the rigorous and limiting idea into experiments which, however convenient in practice and however captivating to a Unitarian and symmetrical thought, may well destroy the vigor and impoverish the roots of life. For that which is perfect and satisfying to the system of the logical reason may yet ignore the truth of life and the living needs of the race. Unity is an idea which is not at all arbitrary or unreal, for unity is the very basis of existence. The oneness that is secretly at the foundation of all things, the evolving spirit in nature, is moved to realize consciously at the top. The evolution moves through diversity, from a simple to a complex oneness. Unity the race moves towards, and must one day realize. But uniformity is not the law of life. Life exists by diversity. It insists that every group, every being shall be, even while one with all the rest in its universality, yet by some principle or ordered detail of variation, unique. The over-centralization, which is the condition of a working uniformity, is not the healthy method of life. Order is indeed the law of life, but not an artificial regulation. The sound order is that which comes from within as the result of a nature that has discovered itself and found its own law and the law of its relations with others. Therefore, the truest order is that which is founded on the greatest possible liberty. For liberty is at once the condition of vigorous variation and the condition of self-finding. Nature secures variation by division into groups, and insists on liberty by the force of individuality in the members of the group. Therefore, the unity of the human race, to be entirely sound and in consonance with the deepest laws of life, must be founded on free groupings, and the groupings again must be the natural association of free individuals. This is an ideal which is certainly impossible to realize under present conditions, or perhaps in any near future of the human race. But it is an ideal which ought to be kept in view, for the more we can approximate to it, the more we can be sure of being on the right road. The artificiality of much in human life is the cause of its most deep-seated maladies. It is not faithful to itself or sincere with nature, and therefore it stumbles and suffers. The utility, the necessity of natural groupings may be seen if we consider the purpose and functioning of one great principle of division in nature, her insistence on diversity of language. The seeking for a common language for all mankind was very strong at the close of the last and the beginning of the present century, and gave rise to several experiments, none of which could get to any vital permanence. Now, whatever may be the need of a common medium of communication for mankind, and however it may be served by the general use, either of an artificial and conventional language, or of some natural tongue, as Latin, and later on, to a slight extent, French, was for some time the common cultural tongue of intercourse between the European nations, or Sanskrit for the Indian peoples. No unification which destroyed or overshadowed, dwarfed and discouraged the large and free use of the varying natural languages of humanity could fail to be detrimental to human life and progress. The legend of the Tower of Babel speaks of the diversity of tongues as a curse laid on the race. But whatever its disadvantages, and they tend more and more to be minimized by the growth of civilization and increasing intercourse, it has been rather a blessing than a curse, a gift to mankind rather than a disability laid upon it. The purposeless exaggeration of anything is always an evil, and an excessive pullulation of varying tongues that serve no purpose in the expression of a real diversity of spirit and culture is certainly a stumbling block rather than a help. But this excess, though it existed in the past, is hardly a possibility of the future. Footnote: in India, the pedants enumerate I know not how many hundred languages. This is a stupid misstatement. There are about a dozen great tongues. The rest are either dialects or aboriginal survivals of tribal speech that are bound to disappear. The tendency is rather in the opposite direction. In former times, diversity of language helped to create a barrier to knowledge and sympathy, was often made the pretext even of an actual antipathy, and tended to a too rigid division. The lack of sufficient interpenetration kept up both a passive want of understanding and a fruitful crop of active misunderstandings. But this was an inevitable evil of a particular stage of growth, an exaggeration of the necessity that then existed for the vigorous development of strongly individualized group souls in the human race. These disadvantages have not yet been abolished. But with closer intercourse and the growing desire of men and nations for the knowledge of each other's thought and spirit and personality, they have diminished, and tend to diminish more and more, and there is no reason why, in the end, they should not become inoperative. Diversity of language serves two important ends of the human spirit: a use of unification and a use of variation. A language helps to bring those who speak it into a certain large unity of growing thought, formed temperament, ripening spirit. It is an intellectual, aesthetic, and expressive bond which tempers division where division exists, and strengthens unity where unity has been achieved. Especially it gives self-consciousness to national or racial unity, and creates the bond of a common self-expression and a common record of achievement. On the other hand, it is a means of national differentiation, and perhaps the most powerful of all, not a barren principle of division merely, but a fruitful and helpful differentiation. For each language is the sign and power of the soul of the people which naturally speaks it. Each develops, therefore, its own peculiar spirit, thought temperament, way of dealing with life and knowledge and experience. If it receives and welcomes the thought, the life experience, the spiritual impact of other nations, still it transforms them into something new of its own, and by that power of transmutation, it enriches the life of humanity with its fruitful borrowings, and does not merely repeat what had been gained elsewhere. Therefore, it is of the utmost value to a nation, a human group soul, to preserve its language and to make of it a strong and living cultural instrument. A nation, race, or people which loses its language cannot live its whole life or its real life. And this advantage to the national life is at the same time an advantage to the general life of the human race. How much a distinct human group loses by not possessing a separate tongue of its own, or by exchanging its natural self-expression for an alien form of speech, can be seen by the examples of the British colonies, the United States of America, and Ireland. The colonies are rather separate peoples in the psychological sense, although they are not as yet separate nations. English, for the most part, or at the lowest, in great part, in their origin and political and social sympathy, they are not replicas of England, but have already a different temperament, a bent of their own, a developing special character. But this new personality can only appear in the more outward and mechanical parts of their life, and even there in no great, effective, and fruitful fashion. The British colonies do not count in the culture of the world, because they have no native culture, because by the fact of their speech they are and must be mere provinces of England. Whatever peculiarities they may develop in their mental life tend to create a type of provincialism and not a central, intellectual, aesthetic, spiritual life of their own, with its distinct importance for mankind. For the same reason, the whole of America, in spite of its powerfully independent political and economic being, has tended to be culturally a province of Europe, the South and Center by their dependence on the Spanish, and the North by its dependence on the English language. The life of the United States alone tends and strives to become a great and separate cultural existence, but its success is not commensurate with its power. Culturally, it is still to a great extent a province of England. Neither its literature, in spite of 2 or 3 great names, nor its art, nor its thought, nor anything else on the higher levels of the mind, has been able to arrive at a vigorous maturity, independent in its soul type. And this because its instrument of self-expression, the language which the national mind ought to shape and be in turn shaped by it, was formed and must continue to be formed by another country with a different mentality, and must there find its center and its law of development. In old times, America would have evolved and changed the English language according to its own needs until it became a new speech, as the medieval nations dealt with Latin, and arrived in this way at a characteristic instrument of self-expression. But under modern conditions, this is not easily possible. Footnote: it is affirmed that now such an independent development is taking place in America. It has to be seen how far this becomes a truly vigorous reality. At present, it has amounted only to a provincial turn, a sort of national slang or a racy oddity. Even in the farthest development, it would only be a sort of dialect, not a national language. Ireland had its own tongue when it had its own free nationality and culture, and its loss was a loss to humanity as well as to the Irish nation. For what might not this Celtic race, with its fine psychic turn and quick intelligence and delicate imagination, which did so much in the beginning for European culture and religion, have given to the world through all these centuries under natural conditions? But the forcible imposition of a foreign tongue and the turning of a nation into a province left Ireland for so many centuries mute and culturally stagnant, a dead force in the life of Europe. Nor can we count as an adequate compensation for this loss the small indirect influence of the race upon English culture, or the few direct contributions made by gifted Irishmen, forced to pour their natural genius into a foreign mold of thought. Even when Ireland, in her struggle for freedom, was striving to recover her free soul and give it a voice, she has been hampered by having to use a tongue which does not naturally express her spirit and peculiar bent. In time, she may conquer the obstacle, make this tongue her own, force it to express her, but it will be long, if ever, before she can do it with the same richness, force, and unfettered individuality as she would have done in her Gaelic speech. That speech she had tried to recover, but the natural obstacles have been and are likely always to be too heavy and too strongly established for any complete success in that endeavor. Modern India is another striking example. Nothing has stood more in the way of the rapid progress in India. Nothing has more successfully prevented her self-finding and development under modern conditions than the long overshadowing of the Indian tongues as cultural instruments by the English language. It is significant that the one sub-nation in India, which from the first refused to undergo this yoke, devoted itself to the development of its language, made that for long its principal preoccupation, gave to it its most original minds and most living energies, getting through everything else perfunctorily, neglecting commerce, doing politics as an intellectual and oratorical pastime. That is Bengal, which first recovered its soul, re-spiritualized itself, forced the whole world to hear of its great spiritual personalities, gave it the first modern Indian poet and Indian scientist of world fame and achievement, restored the moribund art of India to life and power, first made her count again in the culture of the world, first, as a reward in the outer life, arrived at a vital political consciousness and a living political movement, not imitative and derivative in its spirit and its central ideal. Footnote. Now, of course, everything has changed, and these remarks are no longer applicable to the actual state of things in India. For so much does language count in the life of a nation. For so much does it count to the advantage of humanity at large, that its group souls should preserve and develop and use with a vigorous group individuality their natural instrument of expression. A common language makes for unity, and therefore it might be said that the unity of the human race demands unity of language. The advantages of diversity must be foregone for this greater good, however serious the temporary sacrifice. But it makes for a real, fruitful, living unity only when it is the natural expression of the race, or has been made natural by a long adaptation and development from within. The history of universal tongues, spoken by peoples to whom they were not natural, is not encouraging. Always they have tended to become dead tongues, sterilizing so long as they kept their hold, fruitful only when they were decomposed and broken up into new derivative languages, or departed, leaving the old speech, where that still persisted, to revive with this new stamp and influence upon it. Latin, after its first century of general domination in the West, became a dead thing, impotent for creation, and generated no new or living and evolving culture in the nations that spoke it. Even so great a force as Christianity could not give it a new life. The times during which it was an instrument of European thought were precisely those in which that thought was heaviest, most traditional, and least fruitful. A rapid and vigorous new life only grew up when the languages which appeared out of the detritus of dying Latin, or the old languages which had not been lost, took its place as the complete instruments of national culture. For it is not enough that the national language should be spoken by the people. It must be the expression of its higher life and thought. A language that survives only as a patois or a provincial tongue, like Welsh after the English conquest, or Breton or Provençal in France, or as Czech survived once in Austria, or Ruthenian and Lithuanian in Imperial Russia, languishes, becomes sterile, and does not serve all the true purpose of survival. Language is the sign of the cultural life of a people, the index of its soul in thought and mind that stands behind and enriches its soul in action. Therefore, it is here that the phenomena and utilities of diversity may be most readily seized, more than in mere outward things. But these truths are important because they apply equally to the thing which it expresses and symbolizes, and serves as an instrument. Diversity of language is worth keeping, because diversity of cultures and differentiation of soul groups are worth keeping, and because without that diversity, life cannot have full play. For in its absence, there is a danger, almost an inevitability of decline and stagnation. The disappearance of national variation into a single, uniform human unity, of which the systematic thinker dreams as an ideal, and which we have seen to be a substantial possibility and even a likelihood if a certain tendency becomes dominant, might lead to political peace, economic well-being, perfect administration, the solution of 100 material problems, as did, on a lesser scale, the Roman unity in old times. But to what eventual good, if it leads to an uncreative sterilization of the mind and the stagnation of the soul of the race? In laying this stress on culture, on the things of the mind and the spirit, there need be no intention of undervaluing the outward material side of life. It is not at all my purpose to belittle that to which nature always attaches so insistent an importance. On the contrary, the inner and the outer depend upon each other. For we see that in the life of a nation, a great period of national culture and vigorous mental and soul life is always part of a general stirring and movement which has its counterpart in the outward political, economic, and practical life of the nation. The cultural brings about or increases the material progress, but also it needs it that it may itself flourish with an entirely full and healthy vigor. The peace, well-being, and settled order of the human world is a thing eminently to be desired, as a basis for a great world culture in which all humanity must be united. But neither of these unities, the outward or inward, ought to be devoid of an element even more important than peace, order, and well-being. Freedom and vigor of life, which can only be assured by variation and by the freedom of the group and of the individual. Not, then, a uniform unity, not a logically simple, a scientifically rigid, a beautifully neat and mechanical sameness, but a living oneness full of healthy freedom and variation, is the ideal which we should keep in view and strive to get realized in man's future. But how is this difficult end to be secured? For if an excessive uniformity and centralization tends to the disappearance of necessary variations and indispensable liberties, a vigorous diversity and strong group individualism may lead to an incurable persistence or constant return of the old separatism, which will prevent human unity from reaching completeness, or even will not allow it to take firm root. For it will not be enough for the constituent groups or divisions to have a certain formal administrative and legislative separateness, like the states of the American Union, if, as there is liberty only in mechanical variations, and all vivid departures from the general norm proceeding from a profounder inner variation are discouraged or forbidden. Nor will it be sufficient to found a unity plus local independence of the German type, for there the real overriding force was a unifying and disciplined Prussianism, and independence survived only in form. Nor will even the English colonial system give us any useful suggestion, for there is their local independence and a separate vigor of life, but the brain, heart, and central spirit are in the metropolitan country, and the rest are at best only outlying posts of the Anglo-Saxon idea. Footnote. This may be less so than before, but the improvement does not go very far. The Swiss cantonal life offers no fruitful similitude, for apart from the exiguity of its proportions and frame, there is the phenomenon of a single Swiss life and practical spirit, with a mental dependence on 3 foreign cultures, sharply dividing the race. A common Swiss culture does not exist. The problem is rather on a larger and more difficult scale, and with greater complexities, that which offered itself for a moment to the British Empire. How, if it is at all possible, to unite Great Britain, Ireland, the colonies, Egypt, India, in a real oneness, throw their gains into a common stock, use their energies for a common end, help them to find the account of their national individuality in a supranational life, yet preserve that individuality, Ireland keeping the Irish soul and life and cultural principle, India the Indian soul and life and cultural principle, the other units developing theirs, not united by a common Anglicization, which was the past empire-building ideal, but held together by a greater, as yet unrealized, principle of free union. Nothing was suggested at any time in the way of a solution, except some sort of bunch or rather bouquet system, unifying its clusters not by the living stalk of a common origin or united past, for that does not exist, but by an artificial thread of administrative unity, which might at any moment be snapped irretrievably by centrifugal forces. But, after all, it may be said, unity is the first need, and should be achieved at any cost, just as national unity was achieved by crushing out the separate existence of the local units. Afterwards, a new principle of group variation may be found other than the nation unit. But the parallel here becomes illusory, because an important factor is lacking. For the history of the birth of the nation is a coalescence of small groups into a larger unit among many similar large units. The old richness of small units, which gave such splendid cultural but unsatisfactory political results in Greece, Italy, and India, was lost. But the principle of life, made vivid by variative diversity, was preserved with nations for the diverse units, and the cultural life of a continent for the common background. Here, nothing of the kind is possible. There will be a sole unity, the world nation. All outer source of diversity will disappear. Therefore, the inner source has to be modified, indeed, subordinated in some way, but preserved and encouraged to survive. It may be that this will not happen. The Unitarian idea may forcefully prevail and turn the existing nations into mere geographical provinces or administrative departments of a single well-mechanized state. But in that case, the outraged need of life will have its revenge, either by a stagnation, a collapse, and a detrition fruitful of new separations, or by some principle of revolt from within. A gospel of anarchism might enforce itself, for example, and break down the world order for a new creation. The question is whether there is not somewhere a principle of unity in diversity, by which this method of action and reaction, creation and destruction, realization and relapse cannot be, if not altogether avoided, yet mitigated in its action, and led to a more serene and harmonious working.